Okay, so it's a very warm welcome to me to Cardiff, from me to Cardiff Business School. I'm going to do essentially a pre-welcome welcome. So actually I'm going to hand over to Robert Lloyd-Griffiths, who many of you will know, to chair the session today. But I'm essentially going to do a little bit of housekeeping in relation to the business school. So we're all here to hear Tom, who's Chief Economist at the Welsh Government, speak about the Welsh economy. But those of you who have just joined us and who don't know me, I'm Professor Melanie Jones. I head up the economics section at the business school, and I also lead the Wales Productivity Forum, who are partnering on this event today. What I want to do is just tell you a little bit about how this fits into a series of activities that we have going on in the business school to make you aware of our breakfast briefings if you're not already aware of them. So those are sessions like this where we invite a whole host of people to talk about a range of different issues. And there are two dates for your diary. One is in November, where we're talking about digital technology and Amazon. And then in December, we're moving on to talk about the NHS. Those are those early morning breakfast briefings, which you can sign up to. But in addition to that, obviously, we do a whole range of more formal education courses. So there's one there listed around sustainable supply chains and doing business in the circular economy. But what we want to do is really to draw your attention to the, whole range of programs and get you to sign up to our distribution list so you do know much more about the opportunities that are on offer. If you want something slightly more formal, if you are leading a business, then think about things like our Help to Grow management program. And clearly, if at the end of today, Tom convinces you that a career in economics is what you should do, then I'm obviously very pleased to hear from you if you're interested in studying either an MSc or even a PhD in economics in the future. So there's a whole range of things going on in the business school aside for these kind of interesting events. There's a QR code, but please do reach out to anyone that's here and they will be able to tell you more information. So what I actually want to do is to say a big thank you to Robert Lloyd-Griffiths for agreeing to chair this event. You'll hear a bit more from me later on, but many of you will know Robert through his role as Director of Wales for ICAEW. I know Robert because he is kind enough to chair the Wales Forum of the Productivity Institute. That Productivity Institute brings together businesses, policymakers and public sector leaders and academics to try and improve productivity in Wales. Robert not only brings his business expertise to that, but I think there are a couple of forum members here and we can testify for the real commitment and the passion that he brings to that role that really does help us all raise our game in terms of thinking about how we can improve the Welsh economy. So I'm delighted to hand over to Robert to chair the event today.
Thank you very much indeed. Well, thank you very much for that very kind welcome. You get four of me at this stage, so I'm thinking people would only prefer just the one, but never mind. Thank you very much indeed, Melanie. Melanie has introduced herself in the introduction, and it's so I think you know who Melanie is. She's joined next to her by Max Monday, who is a professor well, he's the academic lead. Well, Melanie's the academic lead. Max is in the Wales Productivity Forum member, and he's the lead of Wales Economy Research Unit at the Business School. I'm a very proud alumnus of the Business School, having studied here 30 years ago. So it's a great pleasure for me to come back. I'm also a member of the International Advisory Board, but as Melanie intimated, I am chair of the Productivity Forum. It's a great honour for me to do that because we collectively work together with academics and the business community to try and raise our game for productivity in Wales, hugely important for the economic prospects of Wales. So it's a great delight for me to be here today. And it's a great delight for me to be able to introduce our guest, Thomas Nicholls, who's the Chief Economist of Welsh Government. Dr Thomas Nicholls is Chief Economist at the Welsh Treasury, where he leads the economics profession in Welsh Government. With a PhD in economics from Cardiff University, his research focused on regional development and the role of small businesses in driving local growth. Small businesses being crucial to the Wales economy, with 98%, I think, Tom, of businesses being micro businesses here in Wales. Tom has published academic papers on regional economics, SMEs and education outcomes, and has been working on the fiscal and economic issues facing Wales for around 20 years. Now, the format of today is that I shortly will be inviting Tom to give us his presentation. Thereafter, Max and Melanie will give us some thoughts from the presentation. And following that, there'll be an opportunity for questions, both in terms from the floor and from those who join us online as well. So without further ado, my very great pleasure to introduce to you Tom. Here's the dreaded clicker. There we go.
The technology to work, isn't it?
Okay. Thank you, Tom.
Diolch yn fawr, Pan am da. Diolch am y cyfle I siarad â chi heddiw. Thank you very much for the opportunity to speak to you today. I did my PhD here at Cardiff University. This building actually didn't exist at the time, so it's quite nice that I get to come back from time to time, usually on the other side, so I'm usually sat there, so it's the first time I've actually spoken here. So, thank you very much for that opportunity. For those that are sat in the front row, those that are watching HD, apologies for the slightly dishevelled look today. I don't normally look like this. I am into, day 4 of supporting men's health charity. Happy to take donations at the end. I won't do that now. Apologies for that. I am normally looking a bit more clean-shaven than that. I was also very appreciative of the Chancellor, who obviously got wind of today and thought that she had to preempt some of the things I was going to say today. She obviously wanted a word first before I had my word. No, but in all seriousness, I think I've never known, and I've followed a lot of budgets, I've never known a time where the Chancellor comes out 4 weeks before a budget and, tries to communicate to the public about the situation she's facing, the government's facing, the country is facing, and the challenges and the opportunities and what they may have to do to tackle it. I'm going to try and unpack that a little bit for you today. Happy to take some more questions on that in the Q&A, because I think it's the issue of the time, isn't it? And I think today was pretty extraordinary, actually. Not me speaking here, the Chancellor this morning, just to get that straight. Okay, so I'm going to try. You can tell me later where I got through this. I'm going to try and answer these 4 questions. I'm not going to read them out to you. Some of them I may answer rather cryptically. Some of them, hopefully, I'll answer more directly, and some of them, maybe I'll do it in the Q&A if I don't get there, so apologies. Okay. So the content I'm going to present to you today is all in a report we published on the 14th of October. I'm sure you've all read it by now. It was 90 pages, 74 charts, 24,000 words. The First Minister is very pleased that I'm sticking to very short documents. But, if you've not quite finished it yet, I'm here to give you a bit of flavour and highlight a few things. If you want the cheat code to it, we've also just published like 5 essential insights with some speaking notes next to it, so you can even pretend you've read it. If next time you see me, just say, "Oh, I love that bit," and all you've read is that's fine. You can dip into it. You can read it in chunks. It hasn't got to be read cover to cover. I'd recommend it that way, but not every senior person I've sent it to, I won't say anymore, has read it cover to cover. I'll be honest. And it covers a range of issues. I'm not going to go through all of them today, and I'm not going to list what's there, but that's that. It's not my report, okay? I am the editor, but it is a reflection of the analysis and the quality of colleagues' work that's happening in Welsh Government, and that we are advising ministers and policy officials on. And it only feels right that that's seized public, and you can kind of see the context in which decisions are being made, especially in light of the Welsh Government's budget, which stage 1 was published on the 14th, and the second stage with more detail was out yesterday. So this sets the context for that. Right, first point I'm going to make, probably one of the most important ones, is just how integrated the Welsh economy is to the UK more generally. And so a lot of the stuff I'm going to talk to you today, I'll make no apology, I'm going to use a lot of UK data. Partly, it's because UK data is a bit more reliable, a bit more, there's more availability of it, but also because it's telling us a really important story of how it will impact on Wales. I've got a chart here just showing how this is business-to-business purchases, so we're not including consumers at this, and this comes from the Wales Trade Survey, which is another Welsh Government publication, and just shows just how much trade between businesses happens within the UK, within Wales, from Wales, and then also internationally. And Wales is a really open economy. Wales trades a really high share of its economy internationally, but that's dwarfed by what happens with the UK. And I think that's quite easily forgotten. So I will make no excuse of it. I will talk a lot about the UK economy, and I will draw any distinction of where Wales is different. I will also going to talk about the fiscal situation. And that mainly will be about what's happening at the UK level. And as I say, the Chancellor was very kind today to set that up for me, and I'll try and unpack that a little bit for you if there's a few things you'd like to explore a bit further, and maybe we can do that in the Q&A. But the reason why the UK fiscal situation matters so much is, despite the advent of fiscal devolution in 2018, Welsh Government getting more tax powers, you can see from this chart that for our draft budget that we've just published, still around 80% of our budget is coming from a grant from the UK government. So if the UK government is finding fiscal sustainability an issue, you can bet that probably the knock-on impact is going to be in funding for the Welsh Government, and also probably then for local authorities, a sort of kind of knock-on impact. And so it's a really important place to start when we're thinking about the kind of fiscal context for Wales and its budget as well. Right. I said probably that was the most important chart. So this probably is the most important chart. So if you fall asleep after this, I won't be offended. Stay awake for this one. I'll get you through it, and we'll wake you up at the end. No, on a serious note, this shows the UK economic output since the start of devolution, because that's when the world started, right? Devolution, yeah, 99, something like that. Anyway, but I've started it here for 99 for, you got to start it somewhere, haven't you? And you can see there's almost a straight line. This is quarterly economic growth for the UK, straight line from 99 all the way up to about 2007. It was unbelievably predictable. And we could have gone further back, actually, and you could have gone to maybe the early 90s. But even if you go back to looking at average growth from post-war, the UK, up until 2007, was growing at between 2.5–3% a year. Yes, we've had recessions and it bounced back, but on average, it was growing around 2.5–3% a year. And you can see it's almost a straight line up until 2007, 2008, the global financial crisis. Two things happened for the UK there. Output falls, as shown by the line, but more importantly, the trend at which the economy is then growing. So the line, it's not parallel to that trend from 99 to 2007. It's now flatter. So the trend rate for the economy has now decreased post 2007. And this is largely driven by a decrease in productivity. We then get to COVID, and you can see there's a massive decrease in economic output during COVID. Pleased to say that living standards normally are highly correlated with GDP. In that period, it wasn't. There was a fantastic amount of government support, extraordinary amount of money put into the economy by the UK government and partly the Welsh Government, but the UK government had more levers to do that, more fiscal power to support living standards. Okay, so luckily in that period, despite economic growth falling considerably, living standards were relatively maintained, material living standards. So I appreciate there was a health crisis at the time. We then come out of COVID, we enter the cost of living crisis. This takes account of inflation, okay? So even after inflation, what we then have is a trend which is even lower than the post-financial crisis. So we are now growing at around 0.5% to 1% a year, compared to the 2.5–3% in the earlier period. Now, not only does this impact on living standards, it will feed through to public sector finances, which we'll talk a little bit about. But why does it matter? 2%, 1%, why does that matter? Even if we were growing at 2% a year, the economy would double every 30, 35 years. Okay. At 1% a year, the economy will only double about every 70, 72 years. Okay. So it's a massive change just from that 1 percentage point. And that will also be reflected in living standards. Okay. So what's going on within the UK? This is a slightly different chart. It's showing GDP per head, so economic output per head, just so you can share it across the regions of the UK. And I've indexed it back to around the start of devolution, again, when the world started. And And you can see how economic output per head has changed in the regions since that period. You can note that London is the outlier there, as it is with many economic statistics. Okay, it kind of distorts the UK, and that's performed the best region of the UK countries and English regions. And the grey area there is showing every other region. I've not put it there for clarity. But you can then see how Wales then compares to the UK. I've got UK here, less extra regio, which is basically removing stuff that's happening offshore where you can't really assign where it's happening. Okay, so it's probably the best comparator when you're looking at within UK comparisons. So there's a really interesting story here. If you look at the trend of what's happened for the economy growing on a per head basis since '98, Wales had a bit of a catch-up, actually, with the rest of the UK. We had this period post, interestingly, global financial crisis, where Wales's economic output was catching up with the rest of the UK. We then have the post-COVID, and actually that's when the data is suggesting that Wales's economy has actually then lost a bit of ground on the UK, and you can see where the latest stats are, the furthest right on that chart, that we're sort of middle of the pack now compared to growth from the beginning of the period in terms of the growth from the beginning. And as I say, London's still at the top. Next chart, let's talk about, we talked about economic growth, but why does that matter? How does that affect you? How does it affect me? How does it affect the people outside? How does it affect the people of Wales? What we're interested there is living standards. It's all fine having economic growth, but what happens to living standards? So what I'm showing here is living standards measured by gross disposable household income. And this is showing all relative to the UK. So the black flat line isn't an ONS quirk. We won't go into that about ONS today. There's many challenges at the minute, and COVID obviously didn't help. It's my line at 100, and that is the UK. So everything here is based relative to that line. And again, consistent with what happens with economic statistics in the UK, we have London and the South East way above the UK, distorting the UK average, actually. London's even increased in that period. So relative to the UK, material living standards, according to this measure, has increased relative to the rest of the UK. Wales is in with the rest of the pack. And I put another few regions there, Northern Ireland and some Northern England regions, Yorkshire, the North East. So living standards in Wales is about 15%, maybe 17% below the UK, according to this measure of gross disposable household income. But you can measure living standards in many different ways. Okay, I've shown you a measure based, quite a common measure based on income. Another way to look at it could be to look at consumption or your expenditure. So what happens when we look at that and look at Wales relative to the rest of the UK and the regions and countries within the UK? The story is a bit different. Firstly, Wales is ranked above other regions. It's also only about 7%, 6.9% there, below the UK average. So actually, when you measure this on a consumption or expenditure basis, living standards, according to this measure, would suggest they're not that much lower than compared to income. Again, noting London and the South East are still the outliers, not quite as much as an outlier as they were, but they are still the outlier from the UK. Wales is in the pack there. So that's an interesting conundrum. I think it's also a part of being in the UK. You could say, how is that sustainable, that you're maybe spending more than you're relative to your income levels? I think there's a story there about relative wealth levels and the types of households we have in Wales. We have relatively more homeowners, we have relatively more pensioners, and so they will draw down assets and support their living standards, not through what they're earning, but through drawing down on their assets to maintain living standards and consumption patterns that way. And this is all part of being part of that UK economy of flows of income, flows of assets, flows of people. The labour market. This is probably one of the biggest economic success stories for Wales in devolution, I think. And that's what's happened to the labour market since the start of devolution. I'm showing two sets of data here, the APS, that's the Annual Population Survey, and the LFS, the Labour Force Survey. The Annual Population Survey is about 4 times the size of the Labour Force Survey. It's a measure I would say is more robust. It's got its own issues. It is produced by the ONS, and it is a labour market survey. The LFS, as I say, is about a quarter of the size, but it is more timely and used to be the headline measure. And with the issues that ONS have had with the LFS at a regional level, it's no longer the leading headline measure. But you can see that the two have trended very closely together. And if we just concentrate on the APS, which, as I say, is a lot more robust, it's a lot larger, 4 times roughly, you can see that the measure on the APS is showing that actually we're close to a highest it's been. Maybe 2 years ago it was actually at its highest level of employment rate since 2004. And if I was to take this further back, you would not have an employment rate as high as that. It would not be high. So I think we're quite sure in saying, and we can't categorically say because we haven't got the data, but we've never had an employment rate around this high ever. And that's a really good story. Okay, so this is the employment rate over that year. Over those years, we've also had an increase just in the people in employment. Okay, and that increase in employment has happened twofold. One, there's more people. Okay, you get more people, you'd expect more unemployment. Okay, so about a third of the increase in total employment over the period's evolution has happened from just having more people. Okay, quite mechanical effect. About 2/3 of that has actually come from the increasing employment rate. The UK is the opposite. Over that period, the UK has had about a third of its increase in employment coming from an increase in the employment rate and 2/3 just from sheer population increase. Okay, so the increasing employment rate for Wales is, better, relatively better over that period than the UK. We still got an employment rate below the UK rate. Okay, and we'll explore why in the next chart. But it's a really high, it's a really successful story there that we have more people in employment than ever before, and the employment rate is close to its highest that's ever been as well. So what's the story about employment? Why do we not have full employment? Okay, and probably the first place you go to is unemployment. I'm not going to show you unemployment, okay, because that's not the story. Unemployment is about 4.5% of the working age population. How big's that? Less than a Principality Stadium full. You're looking at about 60,000, maybe 70,000 at a push. It's not small, it's not insignificant, and I'm not saying it's not an issue. What I'm going to show you here is economic inactivity. That is between 200 and 250,000. Okay, so it's way larger than the unemployed. Okay, and that is the story. That is, about 20-25% of the workforce are classified as economically inactive. What does that mean? It means they're not in work, obviously they'll be in employment. They're not looking for work, so they're not classified as unemployed. They could be full-time students. We could have people here who might be classified as economically inactive. Absolutely, we don't have this in a negative view. It's not a problem. You're investing in your human capital, okay? So when I look at economic inactivity, you'd probably strip them out of the data here. But if you work 1 hour, even as a part-time, you'd be classified as employed. But if you're a full-time student not working, I've taken you out of this, okay? So what have you got left? You can see that just under half of the economically inactive, once you take out students, is from long-term sick. It's the major contributor to economic inactivity in Wales. It's common also in the UK. We have a relatively higher share of it here in Wales. And there's some really interesting trends that's happened here. If we have a look, the trend was slowly decreasing over the period since 2004, okay? We then have a period, of the teens where it's sort of flatlined. I don't think we can say it's flatlined in the last 5 years. It's definitely increased. Okay, really interesting trend that long-term sick has increased, and that's a concern. Why has it happened? It's happened at the UK as well. I don't think there's a definitive answer. Unfortunately, I'm not here to give many definitive answers, I'm afraid. So apologies. There's a number of hypotheses. It seems to have coincided a bit with COVID, and as I say, the data is a little bit, when you start digging below the UK, the quality of it does start to get worse. And so if you look at UK data, what happened? Actually, suggesting that economic inactivity caused by long-term sickness may have actually start rising before COVID. So it's not clear it was just because of COVID. Even if it was COVID, it's not clear what it might have been of COVID. Was it people got detached from the labour market? Was it people made different life choices? Was it long COVID. Various hypotheses have been put forward. I think what's quite interesting with this as well is that, looking after the family home, that hasn't increased. So that would be one of the hypotheses. You say, well, actually, they've withdrawn from the labour market, they're choosing to do different. More retirement. Well, that's increased a little bit over the last few years, but not massively. You wouldn't say that's a one-for-one. So it's quite a confusing story about what's happened there. And it's something I would, and, Mel's actively looking at it and still is. And it's a really interesting phenomenon, something which I think is the policy issue of our time in terms of what's going on with the labour market. Right, public finances. Who knew they'd be so sexy and the Chancellor would talk to us at 8:10 in the morning, eh? Oh, I'll tell you what, I didn't know. I thought it was like Christmas. I'll tell you. Anyway, sorry. Maybe it says something about me then. Sorry. Maybe not everyone enjoys that. Right, so this is what the UK government's trying to do in a nutshell. I call it the UK government's Fiscal Balancing Act. It's got a number of fiscal rules, but the main fiscal rule it's trying to balance is this equation in 29/30. Okay, it's got taxes coming in, and then it's spending on debt interest, it's spending on welfare. And when I say welfare, I mean pensions and out-of-work benefits. Okay, it's really important that we include both in that. Okay, and day-to-day spending. Day-to-day spending is basically funding public services like nurses, teachers. It's not the building of hospitals or schools. Okay, so that's different. I'd call that investment spending and have that separate. So the government has got to make that balance in 29/30. Okay. Now, it could do that by issuing more debt, and that would give it more resources to fund in 29/30, but that would add to the debt interest. Okay, so then, you're adding on that side. Okay, so that's a problem. It's also got a separate rule where actually debt, we can talk about the measure it uses, is actually got to be falling as well by 29/30. So all eyes are on what do you do about spending, or do you increase taxes to make this balance? Now, the Office for Budget Responsibility is, I don't think it's I don't think it's a myth, or I think it's quite common in that they are likely to downgrade what they think the UK economy is going to do in a few years' time. I might be wrong, but that's what everyone is saying, suggesting, and that's why the Chancellor came out today. I think she even said it in her speech today that she thinks the OBR will be downgrading economic growth, productivity growth, actually. So they've just come out and said, basically, it's a backhanded way of saying your tax raising potential of the economy is probably not as big as we thought. So they're going to come out and say, you're not going to raise as much taxes as we thought. So suddenly this balancing act has just fallen. Okay, we had that a little bit in the spring, and that was all mainly because of debt interest. Actually, if I'm honest, that was a lot of it. So what did the Chancellor try to do? They tried to reduce welfare spending. That actually hasn't materialised. The politics side of it prevented it so far. So the welfare spending to balance that was tried in March, and now they didn't get that. They haven't got that now. So now they've got to get even back to the March numbers. They've got to find some more way of balancing that. In terms of how finely balanced this is and how acute this is, I'm calling it the scale tolerance, but the scale tolerance, or people call it the fiscal headroom. Okay, that is basically 10 billion. And I think a lot of commentators reckon that when the OBR say that the productivity potential of the UK, the growth potential is reduced, that will more than wipe that out. Could be twice as much as that, but it will wipe out that headroom. That's even before we think about the welfare measures, which did get through in the end, which they were meant to make this balance back in March. And it's really small. I mean, 10 billion sounds like a lot. Don't get me wrong. That's a large sum, but it's only the equivalent of 0.3% of GDP. It's a very small amount. It's 0.7% of tax revenues. When I used to forecast tax revenues, I was very pleased if I forecast tax revenues within 10%. Don't get me wrong, that's probably reflecting more on my ability to forecast, and I'm sure the Chancellor has many better analysts than me in terms of doing forecasts. But the point is, things happen, taxes will move, and you will have some error, unfortunately. So that is a really wafer thin headroom. And I've just said that the OBR has made an assumption change, which is probably just going to wipe that out. So now they've got to try and make that balance. One of the big driving forces of that has been what's happening on the cost of servicing debt. So this is just the costs of paying down the interest on debt. Okay, so don't think of it like your mortgage. It's not paying down the capital for those that have a mortgage, are fortunate enough to, or unfortunate enough, I don't know which way round. just paying the interest, it is now the equivalent of around 4% of GDP. I think the Chancellor said today they were spending £1.10 tax revenue on interest now. It's an enormous amount. That is, what other ways can we put this? It's the same as the whole of corporation tax brings in, one of the big taxes the UK government has. It's the same or more than England spends on education, on defence. This is a major spending area now. I'm not saying we shouldn't borrow. It's just the opportunity cost is there in terms of how much is being spent just on interest. And you can see that has changed radically. You can see the trend on that. And what's happened there is there's been a horrible combination, unfortunate combination of an increase in debt, so your interest goes up just mechanically because you've got more debt to service, and the cost at which that debt is being paid back has gone up as well. And those two combinations have combined to increase that, and that's what we've seen over the most recent years. So that's another pressure on the UK government finances. I'm conscious of time. We've got lots of charts. I could be here all night, so apologies. But I might have to skip through a few just to make sure you do get home. I would say in the light, but that never really got light today, did it? Everyone's saying that it might have to be on taxes. We can have a debate about what taxes and what the impacts of those are. It's interesting to note that taxes are already forecast to be, probably highest they've been post-war as a share of the economy, which I think is really quite interesting. But then if you compare it to international equivalents, it's relatively low, in terms of some other G7 countries. So that's, there's an interesting phenomenon here, which isn't just going on in the UK. This is an international issue of pressure on public services, pressures, higher debts to service. And so therefore taxes are going up as a share of the economy. What does this mean for Wales? Let's bring it back to here. That's why I'm here. That's why I'm paid. What's going on with the Welsh Government budget? So there were plans by the previous government, and you can see that we plotted those and what the current plans are, which were announced in June. We've got 3 years worth of plans announced in June by the UK government. And this is the Welsh Government resource budget. So the resource budget here is another way of saying that day-to-day budget. So the day-to-day budget, remember, was the one that we just used to pay for nurses, pay for wages for teachers. It's not anything that we do to build anything, okay? So this is the large bulk of the budget to keep public services running. And you can see that there was you can see during the early years of devolution, again, when the world started in 99, we got a budget of about 12 billion based in 23, 24 prices. So this controls for inflation. And you can just see that steady increase of budgets. There is no coincidence that was also when the UK economy was growing. Okay, there is absolutely no coincidence of that. Okay. Public sector finances were in a lot better position. They were able to increase public sector budgets because the economy was growing. And that is why the emphasis of the UK government at the minute is on growth. Because if you get back to those times, then maybe budgets can increase or be in a more sustainable footing. It makes such a difference. So we have the early period of devolution where budgets are increasing, and then we have the austerity years, okay? And you can see that actually budgets after inflation actually decreased in that period and then flatlined. We then had around COVID, so this takes away the temporary increases of COVID, but actually, funding to public services did increase around and just after the period of COVID. But then they were planned to decrease again, okay? New UK government comes in and they've increased our budget and gave us 3 years worth, as part of the spending review in June, announced 3 years worth of budgets, so we know what they are going out. So you can see that the new budget that we've announced in October and for 3 years is higher than we thought we were going to have. But interestingly, it's at a higher base, but the trend towards the end is fairly similar. There are some difficult decisions coming in terms of that growth. It's not much. It's about 1.5% a year. Basically the takeaway from that is that line is not growing as fast as it did at the beginning of devolution. Okay, that's the takeaway there. There's a similar one on capital. It's a much smaller share of our budget. I'm happy to talk about that in the Q&A. I'm conscious of time. Let's end on something a bit more positive, shall we? I think this is my final slide. No, that's not the positive bit. The positive bit is this slide. This is a bit complex, but it's probably the most important fiscal element important element that's happened since devolution in Wales. It is the impact of devolved taxation. This is showing us the net additional revenue which is now being applied to the Welsh Government's budget by year as a result of tax devolution. Okay, so this isn't, I showed you a chart very early about how our budget was composed and about 80% was the grant and stuff. This isn't tax revenues. This is the net additional money that comes to Wales now because of tax devolution. Now you could say, but that's because you're taxing people more in Wales. Okay, my challenge to that is, possibly, but we wouldn't have had the ability to do that. And in fact, those revenues would have gone down the M4 to the UK government. So this is net additional money to Wales. Yes, there's an opportunity cost there. You could reduce taxes. That is an option. Okay, and we've just discussed, you do have to fund public services somehow. But parking that, let's just park the policy for a minute. This is just the mechanical impact of tax devolution on the Welsh Government's budget. The Welsh rates of income tax have not changed. Okay? You pay the same income tax in Wales as you do in England. Okay, some of it comes to Wales, but the net impact by the way it was negotiated for the fiscal framework is adding hundreds of millions, and the net impact across all the taxes is it's adding around 450 plus million forecast a year. The Welsh Government's budget. Okay, so it's a really important aspect, and it's a positive story in what's otherwise a gloomy picture, I'm afraid, in terms of public sector finances. And that's my last slide. Thank you.
Thanks, Tom. Thank you very much indeed, Tom. Just a little bit of housekeeping. Those of you who are joining us online, if you'd like to submit any questions that you have, please do so. They will be monitored, and then Linda will tell me what the questions are. There'll also be an opportunity for questions within the room here in the school. So think of your questions or observations or comments. We're going to go at a pace now because we've got about 20 minutes left to finish on time. So I'm going to invite Max and Melanie to join us front and centre, please. And while they're joining us, the first question that I have of them is to give us some thoughts as to what you've just seen and some observations, and to try and keep them quite brief so we give an opportunity for everyone else to contribute. I'm going to go to Melanie first and then to Max. Melanie.
Okay, thank you. So yeah, thanks to Tom, obviously, for what is a really comprehensive report. And I think, as always, what I like about the report is that it's very much a factual report. It doesn't shy away from the fact that we've got challenges with the Welsh economy. And it also raises, I think, a very honest discussion about the data quality issues. I'm going to talk about probably four things. So the first one is our connection with the UK economy. So I very much agree with this idea that we face challenges, but Wales doesn't operate in isolation. It doesn't operate in isolation in terms of the economy, but also in terms of policy. So I think we often go to the Welsh Government to look for a solution, but actually many of the policy levers are much more general at the UK level. And we still have a responsibility in the sense that UK policy has a regional variation in its impact, and so we should monitor it, we should challenge that, but nevertheless, some of those levers lie outside the Welsh Government. I think it's really important, points made about the fact that Wales often appears as an exception if you look relative to the UK average, but actually when you break it down regionally, it's not such an exception. Actually, London and the South East is often more exceptional. I would probably take that slightly a stage further, in that a lot of the discussion is about Wales as a whole, but actually the Welsh economy is very much made up of regional disparities. My second point really is around productivity and the importance of productivity. So I think the kind of good news story on employment isn't mirrored in terms of our living standards, and I think the answer there is because productivity has remained stagnant in Wales and it's below the UK average. In terms then of that challenge, we should think about raising the quality of jobs, not just the quantity of jobs, and so people can add more value. And that indeed is the only sort of long run sustainable solution to improving living standards. My third point was really about the consumption measure, and actually you probably talked a bit about that. I love a new indicator. I like to see a different dimension to the Welsh economy, and I think areas of consumption and expenditure are valid to look like. But to me, that raised as many questions about why that was the case. And I had the concerns about, well, is it people borrowing? Is it people running down savings? To what extent is that sustainable? What are people spending it on? I think there are interesting research questions to come from that. The final observation I had was, we often read these reports and we see the Welsh economy in a certain position, and that obviously has implications for the budget. But there's a kind of, we leave it there, and I really think that there's nothing inevitable about where we are. And actually, economists in Tom's team are well placed to provide some further guidance. I think economics provides a lot of guidance about where you should be spending your money as well. And we didn't talk much about what to spend the budget on. If you spend the budget in the right ways, I think we can help tackle some of the challenge that we have here in Wales. It will be no surprise to many people that I've talked before, but I would talk about things like investment in human capital, in early years, in education, in health, as addressing some of those things, improving productivity, improving growth, and gaining tax revenue to address some of the fiscal challenges.
Thank you, Melanie. Max, some thoughts from you?
Yeah, again, thanks, Tom, for an excellent overview. I would encourage people to look at the larger report. As a great. I have read it, Tom. I have read it. I suppose one of the things, having gone through it, one of the things that struck me is how rich we are as a nation now in terms of the data that we now have compared to when I started. I mean, we were reminiscing earlier about ancient history in the business school. I was thinking when I started, we didn't have the richness of the stats, but we have now. And having said that, I think some of the headlines, particularly the regional analysis within the report, many of the conclusions that are made there with respect to GDP data, perhaps less so productivity, but in terms of differentials between ourselves and the UK, that's a very similar story to what it was in 1986, 1988. It's a very, very similar story. So some of these issues are very, very persistent in the regional economy, in spite of changes in governance arrangements. I share Melanie's concern, I think, with the sad productivity tale in Wales and what that might mean for future public services. But I say that's a Wales and that is a UK issue. And Melanie's already spoken to that. I was very pleased to see the focus. I say one of the things that's really improved recently is the data that we have on trade, the Welsh trade survey that Tom intimated, I think, in his second slide. Exports are still important. International exports are still really important. I know, inter-regional trade, what we do with the UK is important, but the best firms can compete internationally. So our international exports are really important. And one of the things that really concerns me going forward, and this has ramifications for our productivity, is that many of our most important exporting industries in Wales, their short-run output indicators, they're falling away. Our manufacturing exports are very, very vulnerable, very, very vulnerable at the moment. I often say in gatherings like this, there's 10 or 12 companies make up a very, very big share of our manufacturing exports. Several of those players are very, very vulnerable. So our export situation could change very, very quickly. So I think that's one to look out for. There's been a lot written about the foundation economy in Wales and how important it is. Yeah, but international trade is still critical. One of the other elements I picked up in the wider report, which we've might be covered off in the debate, there was a very interesting section in the report about AI adoption amongst Welsh businesses, and some general concerns about the level of digital adoption amongst our manufacturing and services businesses in Wales. And again, you can see how this all boils back, it all funnels back to this productivity problem. So again, I concur with Melanie. Tom's analysis in spite of devolution, we are still so dependent, aren't we, on what happens on the UK government and the international stage. I guess as a plea, Tom, in the analysis for perhaps a little bit more information about what's happening with inward investment, I think that's. I appreciate indulgence. SMEs are very important, but inward investment into Wales, I think, still does have a role to play. I'm saying like the WDA now, aren't I? But
like your thesis was on it, wasn't it?
And I'd say another interesting, but I'll finish with this. Another interesting part of the big report for me was what the research questions that the Welsh Government are interested in the in the coming years. Obviously, an academic, I'm interested in what the RQs are and what Welsh Government might fund in the future. But thank you very much. Thank you very much for that, Tom.
Thanks, Melanie, and thanks, Max. I'll come to the audience, but did you want to go back, Tom, on the that last point that said?
Yeah, on 2 points. I wouldn't mind just touch on the data just quickly. I think it's a really good point. I think I think we take for granted that the wealth of data we do have, and clearly there are some challenges in trying to maintain it, but there has been an awful lot of investment by ONS and also by Welsh Government to improve that. There's more we can do, and we're always asking for more. But I think that does have to be acknowledged, and it's nice that it is being acknowledged. I think it's something I did take for granted, so I really appreciate that comment because it's something I hadn't really reflected on before, and we do live in, and the ability to analyse it. We take that for granted. Computer software and just being just search the internet and you've got access to it in a way that we never used to. Certainly 20 years ago. Or 30 years ago. That's just brilliant, and so you can produce documents like this. So yes, that's a really good point. Inward investment. No, I totally accept that. There had to be some editorial cuts there somewhere in terms of how much we could draft and not draft in the document. It's already a big document, but rather than that flippant answer, I do accept the really importance of inward investment. I think just generally international connectivity, particularly imports, exports, and as you say, if that involves international investment as well, I account that is such a critical part for a modern economy. And for growth, I would really, and it feeds then into productivity, learning by doing, is really important. So yeah, I accept that. It's a really important aspect. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. I'm going to go to the audience for questions. Please put your hand up, and then when I call you, would you just tell me where you're from? But would you perhaps wait until the microphone comes to you? So I'm going to go first to my friend there in the third row.
Thank you. It's a question for yourself, Dr. Thomas. You mentioned at the beginning about mental health work that you're doing at the moment. I'm Dawn, and I'm a writer, and I've got 27 books to my name on social impact. I'm picking up on your point as well about the investment into nursing and the healthcare and education. If we've got so much spending going into the long-term sick and the universal credits, etc., if we were to put more investment into dealing with those issues, we'd get more people back to work, we'd reduce the mental health issues and the traumas that people are living with as a result of either Brexit or COVID, etc. And so that would actually increase the productivity. So why are we seeing why is there an imbalance there? Why is that not being dealt with? Because even yesterday I tried to get an appointment at the doctor's, and it's 3 weeks. I've got to schedule my illness to go in time with the NHS, and that's not helping the productivity of the nation. So what can we do about that as entrepreneurs and as business leaders?
Sure. I think there's no clear answer in terms of what's causing the individual. I mean, you've given a very personal example, and I appreciate you sharing that. But I think in terms of what's causing the kind of macro trends and what would then have a knock-on impact, because that's what, I don't want to generalize too much, but if it's going to have an impact on productivity at the economy level, it's very hard to identify what the kind of specific interventions would be that would improve that. I think in general, everyone except what you said in general, but what is it they can do? And government is doing a lot. Both UK government and Welsh Government is doing a lot to try and improve it, because this isn't a new issue. We had you were looking at economic inactivity for us 20 years ago, wasn't it, or something? And it's not a new issue for Wales. What's interesting is the newer issue is long-term sick, and you can see what share it was. It's increased recently. We don't know whether that might even be a function of universal credit itself. It could be an administrative issue that people are choosing to go down that route and then classified as that. It's a hypothesis. I'm not necessarily saying it's the reason why. So I think I totally agree with the objective, and I think governments do. UK government, Welsh government, Scottish government, they understand the objective. I genuinely think that. How you solve it, that's, I don't think there's a single panacea, and I totally understand like some of the issues you've identified. But in terms of how that would then move the dial on a macro trend, I don't think we've got conclusive evidence of what that one thing is. Yeah. Sure.
Good point. So, thank you very much. Thanks, Tom. I've got a question online. Linda?
Thank you. We've got Hugh Thomas, who's Director of Finance at Hywel Health Board. I think he's going to come off mute and ask his own question.
Okay, excellent. Hugh, hello.
Thank you, and I certainly won't try and answer the previous questioner's question either, but I do recognise the challenge. Naturally, there are disparities within Wales that if you were to map out our economic position in West Wales versus Cardiff, you would probably have a picture that's almost as stark as that graph between London and Wales. I guess my question was in two parts. Firstly, the current, economic disparities that we've got across Wales and the data that's available to that, because it's quite hard as a practitioner working at a regional level to get robust economic data, even data on reasons, economic inactivity, down to a level where we can have a real impact on that in terms of localised planning in the current space. And then if I project that forward, I'm very conscious of the impact that demographic changes are going to have on us over the next 20 years. So rural coastal areas, we're going to have a very significant increase in our over 85-year-old population. It's going to increase by about 80% in Ceredigion. And our working age population over the same period is going to shrink. So the economic disparities and differences we've got now are only going to be exacerbated going forward. So just some reflections on any work that may be being done in those spaces, which could help us locally.
Thank you, Hugh.
Okay, so the report, I admit, is quite light on the intra differences of Wales. Yeah. As I said, it's already 94 pages, so apologies. And I totally accept there are some really interesting stories to be told there in terms of and insights to be said. There are challenges with the data, as the question as Hugh mentions there, in terms of trying to drill down. That's a real frustration I think we find. But there are challenges with surveys, people just not engaging in surveys like they used to. Interestingly, the response rates are really low. So we used to use the annual population survey, which I mentioned earlier, which is a huge survey. And you used to be able to drill down into that to get more local data, particularly to understand a bit more in terms of what's going on in the labour market, economic inactivity. But because so few people are now responding to it compared to what happened about 5 years ago, 7 years ago, and it's an international trend, then the quality of the data, you just can't do that anymore, unfortunately. And it's a real challenge for data collectors such as the ONS with that. And as I say, it's an international challenge. So that, as a person who definitely uses data and would like that, it is something that we are actively pursuing. But there are a lot of, unfortunately, a lot of wider challenges here in terms of getting that data. The trends on the demographics, just really quickly, there is a section on demographics in there, and it is relying on the ONS projections, and that is done only at the Wales level. So I have done that, and there's some really interesting trends that are happening at the Wales level in terms of the ageing society and how that compares relative to England. I've done it on that because that's obviously a big driver in terms of how our funding happens. So there's some really interesting stuff. I've not looked at it within Wales, and I totally accept that there's some, that will probably be exaggerated even more so, particularly as the population is only being, it's really interesting. The trends for Wales at a macro level is the population is only increasing because of migration, intranational and international migration. And obviously that has implications within Wales as well. That's something I've not gone into in the report. We've only looked at it in the macro sense because of how it impacts on the financial issues, but it's a really interesting issue.
Thanks, Tom. Thanks for the question. I can't see any hands up, but please do come to Robert. I've just beg a question myself, and I'll come to Robert. Just very quickly, there was one slide you mentioned that we were catching up with the UK economy, and then we didn't, and then there was a variance.
Yep.
What did we do well that we caught up with the UK economy, and what can we do differently to get back there?
Yeah, great question. So that was the economic output per head, and that was showing how that had changed since the beginning of devolution. And there was a period where we were catching up with the rest of the UK. Now, there's a few strands to this. I mean, we don't definitively know what we were doing right and what we're doing. I mean, what's part of it is the UK was not growing as strongly, actually.
Okay.
So that is if you notice, that period is post-global financial crisis, where the whole economy is growing a bit less. Wales is growing a bit less, but not as low as the rest of the UK, interestingly. So that's why there was a bit of catch-up. Policies may also have been beneficial as well, in terms of, but, so that takes us to what can government do? So let's put it onto the more positive footing. I mean, there's a lot of unknowns there, and I can't really answer what, specifically might have done. But, there's been a lot of, there's a lot of conversation here about, and I hope I don't get the impression that we can't do anything, and Mel kind of alluded to this, there's lots of things that government can do and is doing, but it's more for the medium and long-term levers that we've got. Even the UK government is limited at what it can do in the short term with its levers. Monetary policy is done by the Bank of England. It can't even do that. For Wales, it's even more limited. We've got far fewer taxes, but we do have a lot of levers, what we can do in the medium and long run. And, and having people like Mel involved and advising in terms of what you can do in investing in human capital, thinking about infrastructure, lots of these issues are devolved. And so those are the really important investments to try and move the economy, the productive capacity, increase the productive capacity of the economy and improve economic growth and increase prosperity and living standards.
Thank you for that. I'm going to invite Robert to give a question, and then time is really racing by. What I'm going to do after that is I'm going to come to each of the panel to give us a final thought. I'm going to go to Max, then Melanie, and then you, Tom. And then that should be our time, unfortunately. But first of all, Robert.
Okay, I've scribbled my question down on reflection. So apropos the growth nirvana, GDP, GVA, etc., how does your analysis address or incorporate increasing global warming costs across the world, but of course equally the UK and Wales?
Sure. So it's not directly reflected in GDP. It's one of the downsides of it. GDP is an imperfect measure, unfortunately. So it's not included in that. But, the other kind of objective we have is to get to net zero as well. So it's like, you can think of it as a maximization problem that we have in economics. And what we're trying to do is maximize living standards, maximize economic output, subject to getting to net zero. Okay. And that's the way I kind of view it. So, I'm not saying it's not included there, and there's lots of things. I haven't included something on welfare today, well-being, sorry, on that. But we also produced a week before this came out the well-being report, and I know that's not your question, but there are lots of other objectives that government is trying to do, and it is trying to do net zero. But as I say, whilst trying to maximise living standards, and that's sometimes there are policies we can do that can do both, but sometimes you might have to trade off the other. But net zero is a legal target. So GDP does not reflect that, and there is some content in there about what the cost to get to net zero will be, relative cost, and what some of the benefits might be. The OBR has done some really good work in terms of talking about what the economic output might be from climate change. Now, what's really important with that is that sort of regardless of whether you get to net zero or not, the economy will be damaged, which sort of alludes to your point. The economy will be damaged by global warming, by what happens internationally and how far they go, not how far the UK or Wales goes, because we're such a small share of emissions. And so depending on how high the degrees go, whether it's two degrees before higher than now or 3 degrees, you could have up to an 8% reduction in GDP. So it does come back to it. So actually by not achieving net zero, there would be a cost on the economy, but it's an international issue. We could still suffer that and get to net zero. So that's the global problem, and that's why you need a global solution to solve that. So there is some content on that. I haven't spoken about it today. Apologies about that. But yeah, it's a really fair point in terms of what GDP captures and what it doesn't. I wouldn't say it's inadequate. It's just careful how we use it. It doesn't say everything, I think.
Thanks for that, Tom. As I said, I'm going to come to each of the panel who are going to give us a very quick, I'm sure, final thought. And Max, I'm going to give you first.
Okay. I just scribbled quite a few notes here, but just while it's on my mind, I mean, in answer to Robert's question, there's a difference between production point emissions and our consumption. And in Wales, obviously, our production point emissions have dived down because of what's happened to Tata. It's the emissions that are connected to our consumption that's a problem. So when we're looking at these, these important climate change, we've got to look at the emissions that are connected with Welsh consumption, not just Welsh production. Just one thought, Rob. I think the question about the importance of the intra-regional divides. I appreciate there's a limit to what Tom and his colleagues can cover off in the report, but that those divides within Wales, uneven access to economic opportunity in Wales is a real problem, and sometimes we do miss that when we compare Wales with the UK average. We do need to be. So, for example, as a report come out this week, I think by the Industrial Alliance, there are huge differences between access to economic opportunity in Cardiff compared to Merthyr, compared to Blaen y Gwent, and those are very important. So, those are just some quick thoughts from me.
Thanks very much indeed, Melanie. Some final thoughts.
Thank you. So, I think, and it's always my thought. I think there's always a tendency to focus on the here and now and the challenges we face. I think the figures we've seen are entirely consistent with this being a sustained, a persistent problem, which requires a step change in our thinking. And for me, it requires us to put the future, to focus very much on the future, to do that investment and not to deviate from that plan, no matter how, immediate the kind of shocks are in the short term, because I think that the only way we'll change really the fundamental fortunes of Wales is by sort of focusing on those fundamentals.
Thanks, Melanie. And Tom, some final thoughts.
Just to please download the report, read the report, send your feedback on the report, good, bad feedback. We really appreciate that. Just to know that people are taking an interest in it. It would be, and stop doing it, make it shorter, make it longer, want more. I don't mind. Whatever your views are, all views are welcome. Any feedback would be much appreciated. And thank you all for your time.
So some final thoughts from me. A massive thank you to Linda and the team here at Cardiff the Business School, to Wayne, of course, always, for looking after the technology. For you, Tom, for partnering with the Productivity Forum, the Business School as well. Max, thank you very much for your contribution. Melanie, thank you for what you've had to say as well, and your continued championing of productivity in Wales, which is hugely important. Most of all, Tom, we're most grateful to you. Thank you very much indeed for being with us today. It's been very stimulating. I'm about 3 minutes over. So I apologise. I'm not very productive today in my role. However, it was worth extending the discussions, those extra 3 minutes, and I'm sure you'll stay around perhaps for conversations with other people. So, ladies and gentlemen, please would you show your appreciation to our panel. Thank you.